I will do my best to answer any questions in the comments, but there will be no further updates, no sudden revelations, no continuation of this story. What is done, and what will happen is unavoidable. I'm sharing this with you all because if I don't tell someone, anyone that might listen, I might go mad overthinking it. Maybe it will also help me make sense of what has gone on the past few days and come to terms with a lot of skeletons in my closet. I wish this were only about my old man. Some things are better left buried and, well, every skeleton has been dug up and plastered on the walls. This is one of those very few times where I don't have to alter much at all, save for a few personal details. Maybe that's the most disturbing part. My father suffered 2 successive strokes at the tail end of 2010. It was sudden, unexpected, and it devastated our family to see him in a hospital struggling to write his own name and having severe trouble remembering anyone save for his wife. By the time I had concluded the 3-hour drive from university to visit, he was in better spirits, talking away to himself about his favorite John Wayne film and openly questioning whether he was a fun man to be around, making the nurses and interns chuckle as they tended to him. My dad was the light of any room, and we loved him for it. Even with one half of his body numb and undoubtedly terrified out of his mind, not knowing anyone, he still wanted to make other people smile. My mother stood adjacent to his bed, conferring with the neurologist in a hushed tone, looking over at my father as if staring at a dead man walking. I'll be honest, it was very much like looking at 2 worlds operating simultaneously within the room. My father seemed completely fine, bar the hospital gown and slightly drooped face. My mother looked like she'd already accepted his fate, and the neurologist didn't look any better. Maybe I just fooled myself into thinking the best of things out of sheer exhaustion. Anyone who has ever dealt with a stroke victim knows there's always damage of a collateral nature. Oftentimes it manifests itself in the ugliest and most dreaded form: memory loss. Initially, it wasn't anything too bad. Occasionally, we'd catch him having conversations with people who weren't there, or forgetting names, but he was still the same no-nonsense builder he'd been since I was born. Except now, he harbored frustrations from not being able to work and keep occupied, so his ramblings became longer and far more labored. Trying to get a man who worked his whole life to succumb to the monotony of early retirement at 58 can be a trying and upsetting process for anyone involved, let alone the victim of it. A year later, we were informed he required invasive brain surgery to remove a grade 4 aneurysm in his frontal lobe. Had it been to the left even by a half centimeter, it would have been deemed inoperable. Lucky us. I remember how scared he was the night before the surgery, sitting there in that cold, sterile room. A man pushing 60, surrounded by men 10 to 20 years his senior in medically induced comas, wasn't the most comforting of situations. Up to that point, it was the most terrified I'd ever seen him. I still remember the weak smile he gave before we left him alone in that room. It was the look a man gives you knowing it may be his last. It was a look that screams to me, "I'm scared, but I love you both." My father was not a superstitious man. None of us were. But he was always open to what comes after death, remaining doubtful that there was any notion of a deity or afterlife. But the night of his surgery, I saw doubt in his eyes. He told me what to expect if he didn't make it, what to do with the money, and to continue my university studies no matter what. He even told us what to do in the event he came out of surgery different or brain damaged, which, to put in his own words, was, "Pull the damn plug." We went home that night and didn't sleep. We knew his surgery was early hours of the morning, and neither of us could bear waking up to the sound of an early phone call bearing any kind of news, so we opted to power it out until midday, when we'd get the all clear and could come visit him, undoubtedly cheery and making terrible jokes. We got a call at 7:30 in the morning. In between a nervous breakdown and flippantly ignoring the laws of the road, we got there in one piece. We were greeted with the specialist giving us a labored handshake, proceeding to explain that due to the aneurysm bursting during open surgery, he was forced to make a choice: let my dad die on the operating table, or try to save his life with a very, very risky maneuver. cut off the blood and oxygen supply to his brain in order to clear away the majority of the aneurysm, patch his skull up, and hope he lives through the weekend. He essentially allowed my father to meet the Reaper and shake hands. I was grateful, don't get me wrong, but in those early stages it was difficult. I will never forget the first time I went into the brain injury clinic in Oxford, where the horror began. When I looked down the hall through a sea of coma patients floating in the sea of purgatory, where what was, is, and will be permeates the very fabric of time, expunging the soul from a hollow shell and beckoning it towards the decrepit, emaciated, contorted, and ominous looming creature standing at the epicenter of it all, waiting for each soul to slip away from the body, it is there that I stared death in the face. And it is there I watched him grin at me. I find it hard to describe the sequence of events properly. It's almost like remembering a dream or retelling an old story alongside a friend, and neither of you is 100% certain of which details were right. But something within me convinced me that what I saw was a side effect of the grief, because when I blinked a couple of times and allowed my eyes to adjust to the darkness of the morose ward, the figure disappeared, and I became completely focused on my destination at the end of the hall. Anyone who has ever been to an ICU ward will tell you it's not just the smell that is off-putting, it's the sheer silence, save for the automated machines. The awkward, crushing silence. If the sounds of death could be manifested, they would present themselves in the form of steady beeping and forced breathing. Not many things prepare you for seeing one of your parents in such a state of incapacitation that they are barely recognizable to you. You're told by the neurologists and attending nurses that you won't recognize them, but you always scoff, and in your head just assume that 20 years of being around your parents every day gives you a warranted sense of assurance that you could never forget the contours of their face, the stress lines in their forehead, or the silly way they part their hair. Standing there in front of the figure, bloated from chemicals and being wired up to machines to such a degree that skin is barely visible through the gown, I felt like all familiarity had been banished from my mind. The machines did their job with precision and efficiency, monitoring his heart rate, brain activity, and, most importantly, his blood pressure. If that spiked, it ran a high risk of further complications, so it would send out a loud alarm for the nearest nurse to attend to. It all worked fine, until I started talking to my father. It was during the middle of our conversation, assuring him that all his affairs were being attended to, and that if he wasn't able to make it, not only would I finish my university degree at the time, and that my firstborn son would be named RJ in his honor, that something went wrong. The beeping rang out, cutting the unnatural silence like a gunshot. The nurse calmly walked over and adjusted the machines, explaining that his blood levels were elevated, as if in response to hearing me. My heart broke at the notion, because even at that point, I had resigned myself to the fact he was already gone. I said my goodbyes and promised I'd return tomorrow with my mother. It was only when I reached the other end of the hall that I heard his blood level alarm ringing out again. The nurse hurried over and giving me a pained look as she passed me. Something had made his levels spike to dangerous heights. It was lucky she was there. I felt a chill as I left the hospital to get in my car. I heard a sense of foreboding that didn't leave me until the next time I saw him. Christmas came and went. No signs of change in his condition despite our silent pleas. Mom stayed awake almost constantly, and I blocked out the pain where I could with music, video games, and, ironically, by writing. Relatives said they'd pray and go to church. Friends kept us company. Both gestures were appreciated, but neither did any good in the long run. Just a temporary bandage on an ever-expanding wound. It was New Year's Day when we got a visit from one of our neighbors, Ray. He was a kind, reserved man who generally didn't go outside unless it was a priority. With him being a few weeks short of 90, I certainly couldn't blame him. Seeing him at our front door that afternoon brought with it an odd semblance of comfort. He offered his sympathies and asked if he could speak to us. My mother was suffering from a migraine and retired to her bedroom, leaving us to chat. I poured him a glass of brandy, my dad's favorite, and asked him what he needed.
You know, in my life, I've seen an awful lot. Nearly 100 years on this earth. Most of my friends and family now buried, save for my wife and son. Death has made himself very acquainted with me over the years.
He smiled wistfully into his glass, swirling it as he spoke.
I still remember the fear on my best friend Bill's face when we stormed the beaches at Normandy. He was only a scrawny lad. Switch, we called him. But he was one of our own, and we looked after him as we would a little brother. On the boat over there, I remember him looking out to shore and muttering under his breath, almost pleading. I put my hand on his shoulder and asked him what he was doing. Not breaking his gaze or even blinking, he replied, making a deal with death. 20 minutes later, we hit the beaches, and Bill shoved me out of the way before I tripped a landmine. He lost both his legs and bled to death right there. There was an uncomfortable silence. I didn't really know where this was going, but maybe he was trying to relate to our situation, and I have to admit, it somehow felt comforting, like a grandfather telling you stories as a young boy. He was only 19, poor lad. Gave his life for Queen and country, and for me. Ray stared up from his glass. He looked tired. He coughed and choked as he spoke to me, told me to look after his family, watch over his little sister. Then he apologized. Ray's hands began to shake as he stared at the photo of my father and me from a holiday long past, propped up on the mantelpiece. Why would he apologize? I asked, hoping I wasn't prying too much into an old man's past. Because he saw death looming over, Ray replied, his voice cracking as if he could remember that day with infallible recall. That's understandable, though, given his injuries. I trailed off. Going into detail made me uneasy. No, lad, Ray said, his hands shaking as he downed the last of his glass. He saw death looming over me. There was an uncomfortable silence. I didn't want to be the one to rationalize the situation. I was far too mentally exhausted for that. Eventually, Ray elaborated. You've seen it, haven't you, lad? Something that shouldn't have been there. He stared at me, unblinking. Look, I know what you're saying, but I don't believe in ghosts or supernatural entities. And you think I do? He laughed nervously. Perish the thought. War took away any notion of demons, ghosts, and gods from my mind. Man is the true evil in this world. There is no need for something else to fill that void. But death, well, he is a part of life, whether you want to accept that or not. He poured another glass of brandy. Death has always been shown as a hooded creature with the scythe and the skeletal features. But that's not what most folks see. That's not what I've seen. Judging from the look on your face, that's not what you've seen either. I won't pry any further, and I didn't come here to talk you to death, but I did come here to accomplish 3 things. Offer my sympathies, let you know I understand on many different levels what you're going through, and to issue you a warning. A warning? Why? He stood up to leave, shaking my hand and saying nothing as he walked to the door. It was only when he crossed the threshold and turned back that I saw why he was so reluctant to tell me. The look, the pained, terrified look on his face when he stared into my eyes. Because I've seen him recently, leaning over your father and wailing. He bowed his head and walked down the road, muttering as he did. If it hadn't been so quiet, I may not have picked up on what he said. I wish I'd been unable to. Pity. He's so young, just like Switch.
My dad, incredibly, woke up out of his coma on January 8th, 2012. He'd had a tracheotomy and was unable to speak while it healed. This was more frustrating for him than anything else. Not only unable to communicate properly with us, but due to the trauma his brain had received during surgery, he had virtually no memory of us. The only times we could get him to communicate were if there was only one person there. He seems to really struggle to pay attention otherwise, like there was simply too much to focus on. He would never meet our gaze either, always looking over our shoulder and nodding, some basic form of acknowledgments that ultimately amounted to nothing. Just simple understanding from a simple man. It was after this time we saw he wasn't getting better. We ended up sleeping a lot less, fearing the worst. He saw a neurologist 3 days after he woke up, and they informed us he'd suffered ischemia of the brain, which, by proxy, was causing something akin to Alzheimer's disease. Slow, but progressive. No time frame was ever given, and we were told he would regain most of his memories over time, but would ultimately lose them over the next few years. First, his long term, then his short term. We were devastated. It was heartbreaking to watch him struggle. We made the best of it, and eventually shades of who he once was returned, like light shining through the cracks of a cocoon. He was happier, but calmer and more childlike than he once was. I often felt while visiting that I was now the parent, the proverbial torch handed over to me despite him having survived the ordeal. The only thing that disturbed me all these years was his reluctance to be left alone anywhere. You have to understand that my father was by no stretch of the imagination a timid or weak man. He worked for nearly 40 years as a plumber and builder. He was small, but strong and fiercely independent. To see him reduced to a man who had panic attacks when he was left on his own and not be able to explain why was more troubling than anything else. It was only this past weekend that I found out why. Virtually every time I make the 300-mile drive home, regardless of what time it is or how exhausted I am, I will sit in my living room with my parents and catch up. I'm an only child, and it took them 12 years and the better part of $60,000 to have me through IVF, and I was doted on, even at 23. Once my mother would go to bed, my dad would pour a glass of whiskey, and we'd talk about politics, life, love, and where it all goes. Sometimes we'd discuss the entirety of his injuries. Other times we'd discuss where he'll end up. But he would never ask me anything. Just sit and listen. This particular night, after a hearty laugh over his weight gain due to the medication he was on, he asked me something that still resonates within me. TJ, do you know how many visitors I had while I was in the hospital? It took me a moment to mentally count them all. I had to include the ones from when he'd been in intensive care and non-responsive. 12, including me, Mom, your siblings, my best friends, my ex, and your 2 childhood friends. He gave a weak, grim smile and stared down at his glass, much like Ray had done some years ago. No, son. 13. Dad, you said visitors. I didn't include your specialist. I don't remember much about the recovery process, but I do remember all the voices and smells of the people who visited me. I couldn't tell you when or most of what was said, but lying in that bed, I got to remembering any and every encounter pretty well. And there was always one visitor who set me on edge every single time they visited. Why? Was it something they said? It was the sounds he made, TJ. That god-awful mixture of laughter and soft sobbing coalescing all at once, like some horrible chorus of emotions. It got worse when I woke up. Can you imagine what it's like to sit in a hospital bed, throat healing up, unable to speak or scream, but fully aware of your surroundings? I knew nobody and understood very little, but I still understood the concept of fear. He took in a deep breath. Lying there in that bed, waiting for my 13th visitor to arrive long after you'd all said your tearful goodbyes. He cut the air like a razor blade. He moved freely like blood from an open wound. His face. Oh, God, his face, TJ. The expression was frozen in anger, fear, joy, loss, all at once. He would lean in close, making that horrible fucking sound and stare. Just stare at me, night after night. Unflinching, the sound never ceasing. You never forget a creature like that. He paused for a minute, lit a cigarette, and took a long drag from it, his shaking hands subsiding with each second he inhaled. Once he'd finished, he stood up and turned away, walking towards the conservatory doors, his frame shaking as he did. But not because one side of his body was weak. He wasn't even using his cane. He was sobbing quietly, his back still turned as he tried to hold his composure while talking to me. On the last day, before I was transferred to the general hospital, he came back. He crawled into view, each awkward motion of his limbs complemented by the cracking of dislocated joints, as if he were an old-world spider. There was no grace, no swiftness, no finesse in his movements. It was like watching someone with polio move without their braces. The sounds didn't stop until he reached the foot of my bed. One large snap cut the air, and he rose slowly, the black eyes never stopping their incessant stare. Not once. His face wasn't a mixture of emotion anymore. It was just rage, the kind of rage where laughter seeps through as a nerve reaction. No other sounds, save for his heavy breathing. He got off on my fear. It fed him. It was only after he saw me cowering that he leaned in close to whisper in my ear. My dad turned around, his eyes bloodshot and tears streaming down his face. In 23 years, I've never seen my father cry. It was unnerving, but not as much as what he asked me. That's something that will haunt me to my very grave.
Why, TJ? Why didn't you tell me what was wrong? You never had to go through it alone. I would have understood. I would never have wanted you to die alone like that. So afraid, so isolated, so young.
The floor fell from under me.
I felt faint. How could he know? There's nobody who could have told him.
Not to mention he has no recollection of my teenage years. He put his hands to his mouth, tears flowing freely down his cheeks.
So much blood, so much pressure. He was waiting there, bathing in the blood. He was waiting on the other side for you. He was there when your heart stopped. He was there when the physician spoke to you, when the skies turned back and no light could be seen. How could you have let this happen?
I struggled to find words. This was not a conversation I ever wanted to have with my family. This was my past, not my present or my future. Dad,
How could you have let this happen to my boy? He was innocent.
I froze. Dad was no longer looking at me. His gaze went past my shoulder to something residing behind me. I didn't feel a chill run down my spine in that moment. I gained a sense of dread that I can only describe as the instinct you possess when you feel your life is in imminent danger, worsened only by the fact that I heard no response from behind me or felt any presence. I also felt an overwhelming sadness. I wasn't just worried about some supernatural entity behind me. I was watching my father's mind deteriorate right before my eyes.
My boy, my poor boy. He deserved better than this. He deserved better.
My dad threw his glass at the wall behind me, falling to his knees and sobbing as he did.
My feet acted before the rest of my body did, and I went straight over to him, pulling him in for a hug as he broke down, repeatedly asking why. My mother walked in, alarmed, and saw the state he was in. "Put him to bed, TJ. We'll talk in the morning. I'll clean up the glass." My mother sighed. She might as well have been aging in front of me from the stress that's been put on her the last few years. I managed to get him to his feet, and he silently complied. He passed out as soon as his head hit the pillow. At least he's at peace for now, I thought. I barely slept that night, my dad's story repeating in my head, and the unshakable image of this creature becoming more vivid in my head. I suppose it's a very atypical reaction to being scared, not wanting to sleep for fear of opening your eyes to something looming over you in your room. I was more scared of what my father knew and who had told him. Some skeletons are best left in the closet and thrown in a deep hole. But someone told my father where to dig and what he'd find. I was due to go home the following morning, though truth be told, I wasn't sure I wanted to go anywhere until this was resolved. Unfortunately, bills don't wait for anyone, and if I still wanted a job to come back to Monday morning, I had to leave. I gave my mother a hug and told her I'd be down for Mother's Day. She smiled weakly and told me to call when I was home. Typical mother stuff, but I could tell she was worried and she really needed a holiday. I shook my father's hand and he pulled me in for a hug, tighter than usual. "I love you, son," he croaked. "I know, Dad. I love you too." I patted his shoulder. This kind of behavior was somewhat foreign to us, despite everything. "And I'm sorry. I really am." His voice began to crack. "It's okay, Dad. You've been through a lot, and you had a bit too much to drink. It happens to the best of us." I forced a smile, the pit of my stomach still uneasy with the incident fresh in my mind. "Not for that, TJ. I'm sorry because he's getting closer. I'm sorry because I thought I could reason with him. But he's a force of nature, and he does his job perfectly. I'm sorry because he knows." "Knows what, Dad?" His grip on me tightened. "He knows your time is nearly up, and he never leaves a job unfinished. He just waits. Death is ever patient. He let you go once. He's not going to do it again. I'm so sorry, son." I didn't know what else to say. I patted my father on the shoulder and attempted to recompose myself. I finished my goodbyes and got in the car. As I backed out to the somber wave of my family, I saw my neighbor, Ray, tending to his garden. He gave me a short nod, took off his hat, and bowed his head as I passed. Even he knew. I put on my iPod and let pianos become the teeth blast through as I screamed on my journey home, unable to do anything else. Pity, he's so young, just like Switch. On September 24th, 2007, I was diagnosed with a brain condition that puts immeasurable stress on the brain to cope with the high amount of information constantly surging through it 24/7. There's still a lot they don't know about the condition. He was there when the physician spoke to you, when the skies turned black and no light could be seen. I was told the pressure would eventually form an aneurysm in my head, one that over time would grow and eventually kill me. So much blood, so much pressure. He was waiting there, bathing in the blood. There was a time frame given, but for the sake of some modicum of privacy, I will not go into it. On May 18th, 2008, I attempted to take my own life. I was unsuccessful in my endeavor and have not relapsed since. He was waiting on the other side for you. He was there when your heart stopped. My mom knew about the suicide attempt,
My dad was away on business, and while he knew I had a problem, he never thought it'd get that bad. After much begging and pleading, my mom agreed not to tell him. Neither of them know about my illness or what will happen. I still don't know who told my dad or how he could know.
He never left your side, not even once.
I think the worst part for me as a rational man is the validity of his statements, particularly the last one. He knows your time is up, and he never leaves a job unfinished. It was only 3 months ago I had my last scan. The aneurysm has grown. He is always waiting. He is getting closer. He never leaves a job unfinished.
He deserved better.
And that's a wrap.